chapter, the Gospel according to Luke in chapter 17, and we'll read again at the beginning of the chapter. Then said he to the disciples, "It is impossible but that offences will come. But woe unto him through whom they come. It were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and he cast into the sea, than that he should offend one of these little ones." We realize as we read through the Gospels that the Lord's ministry developed and adapted to the circumstances as they changed, and they were changing. The external circumstances were changing as the opposition to him was growing. But closer to hand as well, the circumstances were changing, because he was preparing the disciples for the day when he would no longer be there. Now, they weren't particularly conscious of that, but conscious of it or not, that's what he was doing. And it's quite interesting as you read through the gospel accounts, you can see a growing emphasis as he has the disciples with him and as he speaks to them. He's preparing them for the day when he will no longer physically be present among them. And he's preparing them for the day when the responsibility of leadership and ministry will fall on their own shoulders. And I believe there's something of that in this passage as well, as the Lord addresses different topics which were relevant to them then at that moment. Of course they were, but which would have even greater relevance in the months and in the years that lay ahead. And so in the chapter, we see him dealing with subjects such as forgiveness, which was mentioned a moment ago in prayer. Then he goes on to deal with thankfulness. He goes on to speak about readiness and so on. Now, hopefully we will see tonight and if we're spared next week and a little beyond that as well, we'll see some of the connections, the way these things are connected one to the other. And we'll see that they actually tie in together. They look on the surface kind of disconnected. These first 6 verses, for instance, they seem random topics, but as we'll see as we go on, they're not actually. They flow one into another. Now, the topic in verses 1 and 2, which is what I want to limit ourselves to tonight, is a problem. I don't mean a problem for us in that sense. I mean generally a problem which the disciples were going to have to deal with, and a problem which the church again and again in every age has to face up to. And we're told that the problem is made all the worse because it's unavoidable. It's an inevitable problem. Then said he to the disciples, "It is impossible but that offenses will come." In other words, he's saying it's impossible to avoid this offense that he's going to speak about. It's an impossible or an unavoidable problem. Now, That raises the question, of course, what offences is the Lord talking about that are unavoidable? Well, there are those who say that the Lord here is talking about simple persecution. The persecution that would come again and again in different waves on the Christian church. And that's what the Lord has in mind here. And he says in verse 2, well, as far as the persecutors are concerned, it would be better for them if a millstone were hanged around their neck and they were cast into the sea. Well, no doubt that is a truth, but is it the truth that we have here? Well, I have to say I'm not convinced at all that that is what the Lord is talking about here. So what then? If it's not straight, simple, straightforward persecution, what is the Lord talking about here? Well, the word that we have translated offences there could be translated traps, or better still, temptations. It is impossible but that temptations will come. If you're familiar with the Gaelic Bible, you'll know that it's the word olavim that it uses there. And that actually catches it very well. An olavim is it's causing someone to stumble. It's causing somebody to offend, not causing them offense as such, but causing them to offend against God, causing them to stumble in their duty toward God so that they are unable to fulfill that duty as they should. And I believe it's in that sense that we are to understand the word offenses here. I'm not suggesting we get rid of the word, but we understand it in that sense. It is impossible, but that there will be times and causes of offense in the life of the people of God. There will always be the danger, he's saying, that either you will cause others to sin, or you will be the recipient and the victim in the situation because other people cause you offense in that sense, that they cause you to sin. And I suppose if there's one thing that's worse than sinning ourselves, it's causing others to sin. It's leading other people down the wrong path. So we believe that's what he's talking about here. It is impossible, and we'll see in a moment why it's impossible. It is impossible, but that there will be such offenses, such temptations as you interact one with another. Short of living on a desert island with nobody else around, it is inevitable, Jesus is saying, as we interact with one another and with the world around us, that there is always a danger that instead of helping each other, we will become a cause of offense and stumbling along the way. Instead of making the road easier, sometimes we will make the road harder. Whether, and that's the particular context here, is obviously for fellow believers, but it can apply beyond that as well to the world out there. Now, we could put all of this under a microscope and spend a lot of time considering it. I'm not sure, in some ways, if I attempt to do that too much, I may end up, as they say, gilding the lily. But perhaps I can just mention one or two categories in connection with this. The most extreme category, I suppose, is where somebody encourages somebody else, either deliberately and willfully, or in some way inadvertently, to open sin. That's the most extreme sort of case. You have an example of this with the 10 spies who come back with their gloomy negative report on the land, and they cause offense to the whole camp of Israel. Caleb and Joshua do not, of course. They come back and they say, well, it's not the easiest place in the world, but the Lord is strong and the Lord has given us his promise and so on. You know all of that. But the 10, of course, come back with the majority report, and they say it's impossible. And what happens? They cause the entire camp to follow them into open defiance and sin against God. Now, that's the extreme example. A less extreme example would be where we would encourage others perhaps to secret sin. Not in the sense that we're sharing the secret with them, but because of something in our lives, perhaps they might reckon that they too can be less strict in their understanding of God's word or in their application of God's word. And we might well, perhaps very inadvertently, encourage other people to secret sin. We might display in our own lives, for example, a lack of respect for God and for his law and for his day and for his word and for his standards generally. And while we don't go around suggesting to other people and putting thoughts into their minds deliberately and actively that they should take a low view of God, nevertheless, by our own attitude to it, our own failure to obviously display a high sense of respect to God and to the things that belong to God, it sort of rubs off on us. It sort of rubs off rather on the other person. And they begin to think, well, you know, maybe I don't have to give so much honor to God or his word or his day or whatever it might be, because I see that this other person who I do respect as a Christian believer is quite lenient, maybe if I can use that word, on that particular issue. Maybe I'm just being too strict altogether. And in that way, the other person's standard slips down a little, and we cause them to offend. We become an offense to them. Their attitude to the things of God is lessened. And that in turn, of course, can lead to a third party coming into the situation and seeing again the standard in the second person's life a little bit lower, so they set it a little bit lower themselves, and gradually the bar goes lower and lower. And instead of encouraging one another and provoking one another to godliness and to good works, what we actually end up doing is encouraging and provoking one another to the very opposite. Now, the person at the top of that chain, who was the first person to allow a bit of laxity, would perhaps be quite shocked if they realized that it was having all of this effect, that there was this stream of effect flowing from their own lives all the way through who knows how many people ultimately. They might be quite shocked and horrified at that. But the truth is, we don't see where any of these things take us. So we can inadvertently encourage others to rebel against the things of God, to be discouraged about the things of God, our inconsistency in our words, in our actions, in our response to people. All of these things have an effect upon other people. How is it that we see it in the life of David? 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 14. Here's Nathan, and he's talking to David. It's David's great sin, of course, Bathsheba and all the rest of it. And Nathan says to David, by this deed, you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, and also had led to the whole standard of spiritual life in Israel having been taken down in a way that was not helpful. The inconsistent believer is doing daily harm to souls. Daily harm to souls. I'm just checking my time there. So we believe that's what he's talking about here. It is impossible, but that offenses will come. Now, why is it impossible? Why is it inevitable? Well, can I suggest 4 reasons? First of all, it is inevitable because of God's decree. It's inevitable because God decreed it like this. The Lord could have, in his sovereign good pleasure, decreed otherwise. He could have ordained it so that it was possible that offenses would not come, that there would be no such problem, and that when men and women are converted, such is their actions and reactions and interactions with one another, that there is no offense, no cause of stumbling, no one sending the other wrong or spoiling the other. He could have decreed it so, but that didn't happen. He decreed that it would be in this way, and this is part of his goodwill and his sovereign purposes. And it is there, not least in order, as we'll see in a minute, to show us our own frailty and our need of grace. So that's the first reason why it's impossible, and that is the paramount reason on which everything else hangs anyway. It is inevitable because of God's decree, but it is also inevitable because of Satan's influence. You don't need me to tell you that Satan is active, and he is active in different ways. Sometimes he comes directly with temptation. He himself becomes the agent of temptation and the agent of offense. He is the one who will make the Christian stumble. And if he can, he will. But of course, oftentimes he comes at us through other people, and the circumstances of life were involving ourselves and other people. And in that way, he will attempt to cause offense and stumbling. A good Old Testament example is Potiphar's wife. Satan wants to spoil Joseph. He wants to spoil his witness. He wants to spoil his own personal godliness. If he can ruin and discredit him, then he will have achieved a great victory. And no doubt he would have tried to do that. But Joseph is kept. He's growing in favor with God and man. And so he then comes through another vehicle. He comes through Potiphar's wife, and you know the temptation. And Joseph responds, how can I then do this great wickedness and sin against God? He says it would be an offense for me to do that. And he asks, he runs from it in order to avoid the offense. But Satan is at work there. And then, of course, there is another example in the life of the Lord himself, where in order to deflect Christ from the cross, Peter becomes the occasion. And Peter's words and Peter's solicitous attitude toward the Lord, where he attempts to turn him from the sufferings of the cross. And Jesus says he says, get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. You're an offense to me. You are a stumbling block. No, the Lord didn't stumble at the stumbling block. Of course he didn't. But that's an example of the way Satan will come. And he is always at work. And that's why we have to be careful. You know, David asks that the Lord would set a watch or a guard on his mouth and on his lips. This is one reason why, because, you know, you can say things and sometimes you realize it, you know, and it's no sooner out than you could just grab it back in again. But other times, quite unwittingly, you say things quite innocently, and the Lord, Satan uses it and twists it in order to cause an offense for others, and maybe to stir up bad feelings in their heart towards you, so that there is a problem in communication. And maybe, as I said earlier on, I was speaking of, where you encourage others to become lax, where you should be doing the very opposite. Again, something you might say, and Satan uses it, and he takes that, and he'll pick and mix from what you say, and he'll say to other people later, did you see what he said? And did you hear what she said? And what did they mean by that? And he'll magnify the whole thing and make it 10 times bigger than it originally was, or sometimes he'll just dress it up and he'll turn it into something else altogether. You would have to erase Satan's influence entirely and remove it before you are going to have a situation where offenses will come. It is inevitable. It's inevitable because of God's decree. It's inevitable because of Satan's influence. Thirdly, it's inevitable because of sin's character. It's in the nature of sin to spread. It's contagious. It's in its character not to stay where it is, but to spread and to cross all sorts of borders. It's virus-like in that sense. It's a killer, it's a disease, and it's in its nature to spread. So it's inevitable because of Satan's influence, because of God's decree, because of sin's character, and because of man's weakness. Because of man's weakness. Into the mix comes our own failure, our own frailty, our own weakness, our lack of faith, and we'll see in a couple of weeks' time how faith fits into some of these things. Our own lack of faith, our own lack of love. If we loved others more, then we would be less inclined to be careless. We would be less inclined to cause offense. We would be more watchful in what we say and how we say it. But because of our love primarily for ourselves rather than for others, these things all have their effect. Because of the weakness of our hope. And I could go on in all of these Christian graces, but I don't want to weary you. It's inevitable because of God's decree, Satan's influence, our nature, and sin's character. It is impossible, but that offenses will come. But then the Lord tells us, and I'm nearly finished anyway, the Lord tells us that we should be in no doubt as to the gravity of this sin. This is something to be watched. It's something to be avoided and to be alert to. And I think there's 2 or 3 ways in which that's emphasized in the passage, and I'm just going to name them. First of all, he attaches a woe to it. The Lord doesn't attach a woe to every single statement that he makes. But when they appear, we're meant to take particular note of them, that there is a particular disapproval on the part of the Lord for whatever the activity might be. And he attaches one of his woes to this one. Woe to those who cause others to stumble. Woe to those who, instead of helping others along, become an occasion of holding them back. Woe to him. Now, that applies, of course, in a very particular way to Satan. Woe to him indeed for all that he is doing and for all that he tries to do. And ultimately, it will not succeed because it is doomed. Woe to Satan. Woe to the world who would try to do this to the believer. And of course, the world does try to do it to the believer. They will try to upset the spiritual apple cart, if you like. And we saw that with Potiphar's wife. Well, woe to her. But what about the Christian, what about the Lord's people? Is it woe to them as well? Well, yes, it is, and yes and no. Their sin is grave. And this reminds us, friends, of our need of the atonement of Christ. This sin, like everything else, must go under the blood. And it reminds us of how lightly we measure sin sometimes. But the Lord measures it in a very different way. And it's good to be reminded of that. So that's the first thing about the Lord's attitude. He attaches this woe to it, and anything there's a woe to, we should be alert to it. The second reason, or the second evidence of the Lord's attitude, is the punishment. Not only does he attach a woe to it, but a particularly grave punishment is mentioned. The millstone round the neck and be cast into the sea. How different God's estimate of sin is to ours. And how, again, if we think of Satan, well, this is what will happen. He will be cast into the bottomless pit, and the millstone will be about his neck. But it's quite a thought, isn't it, that Christ died for your sins and died for these sins as well. And it was hanged about his neck, and he was cast into the foaming rage of divine wrath. And he purchased your liberty and your pardon, even for the offences that you brought. And the third reason that highlights the Lord's attitude to it, the Lord's disapproval of it, is the gentle word that he uses for those who are most hurt by it. It were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he cast into the sea, than he should offend one of those little ones. Now, I don't think it's limited here to young believers, but perhaps it applies to them in a very particular way, because they are easily diverted, easily led astray, easily injured, easily damaged, easily hurt. And our responsibility to them is a particular one. And here's how the Lord regards them. He regards them as his little ones. Let nobody injure them. Let nobody offend them. Let nobody be a cause of stumbling to them, to any who are his little ones, for they are the apple of his eye. And as we get used to one another, and we get used in our interactions to one another, but we should remember that every other believer is one of the little ones. All of them, no matter how long they've been in the Christian life. They are all little ones in that sense. They are his little ones. And how we should treasure them and guard them and seek grace to help them, so that we will cast no stumbling block in their way, and that we will not in any way cause them to be anything other than what they should be. Well, the Lord is putting this before the disciples then, and he's warning them one with the other in their relationships with one another. And he's preparing them for the day when, as we see in Acts chapter 2, we've been looking in these early chapters of Acts on the Lord's day, and there's thousands of little ones coming in there, isn't there? And they would have a special responsibility for them, and they would have to be handled in a very kind and careful and gentle way. And I was thinking of this today, and I must finish. I'm going way over my time, but I was thinking today of Peter, who heard these words, of course. And there he is years later, and he gets caught up with the whole Judaizing issue, and he has to be withstood by Peter, by Paul, and the whole thing becomes very difficult. What was Peter doing? He was causing offense there. He was putting a stumbling block in the way of little ones, little Gentile ones. And instead of helping them, he was doing the very opposite of that. And here's the Lord warning him, and we see Peter, and he's not taking the warning on board. And well, let him who is without sin cast the first stone, friends. None of us can. At any rate, my time is gone. It's impossible then to eradicate this, but it is possible by grace to avoid being implicated in it. If I can maybe put that a better way, it'll always be there, but let's have as little of it. Let's have to do with as little of it as we possibly can. Let's not be involved in it if we can avoid it at all by grace. And at the end of the day, like everything else, we need the blood and we need pardon that comes to poor sinners. So the question is, what have we done today? Have we done more good or done more harm? Have we caused offense? Have we caused stumbling? Have we caused ill will? Have we caused friction? Have we caused disruption? Have we caused laxity? All of these things that I mentioned, and we have to examine ourselves and come to the fountain opened for sin and for uncleanness, and find there grace to help in time of need. Well, we trust the Lord, follow with his blessing, his word. We're going to sing. We're going to do the same as we did last Wednesday. We're going to sing in Gaelic. We normally finish on Saturday with our Gaelic, so see, we don't have a Saturday prayer meeting.